A major Supreme Court ruling signals a major win for college athletes and their compensation. A unanimous decision rules against the NCAA's amateurism rule, giving student athletes more freedom. So let's bring in CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe to break down this case. So a win for student athletes, Rebecca. Tell us more about the case and what this unanimous decision means.
So the Supreme Court held that certain compensation provisions violate the Sherman Antitrust Act, which essentially says, you can't gather together in restraint of trade. You can't create a situation in which you are intentionally coming together and paying somebody less than the market would demand. And the NCAA had essentially made, two central arguments. And one of those arguments was, we're different. We're sort of categorically this different thing, and the Sherman Antitrust Act shouldn't apply to us. And secondly, you have to defer to our definition of amateurism. So what that means is, this is what the NCAA tried to say, which is a little counterintuitive. It's actually pro-competitive for us to be able to control the way we compensate these athletes. Why? Because people want to see amateur athletes, and we define what amateur athletes are. They failed in both regards, but that was the argument that they were trying to make.
So, are you surprised that it was unanimous?
It looked like it was going that way from the oral arguments. I think, anytime you see a unanimous Supreme Court, especially in this day and age, it's somewhat surprising. Kavanaugh wrote separately, and I think his opinion really showed that this ruling may be broader than it at first seems, because it actually only addressed one particular kind of compensation benefits, and that's education-related benefits, like computers, internships related to education. And previously, schools had been barred from compensating athletes in that particular way. This ruling is narrow in that it only says schools can't do that. But the question is, where will this go? In what direction will it go? And Kavanaugh's opinion really suggests that the ruling might end up being broader once further cases are brought. And he said something which I thought was, a pretty good analogy. He said, look, let's say you were a bunch of restaurants, and the restaurants just said, we're going to all come together and agree to pay our cooks way less. We're going to pay them just $5 an hour. And the reason why we're doing that is people like to eat food from amateur chefs, from chefs that are paid less. And that seems kind of absurd when he puts it that way, but that is a little bit the way this whole thing works. So what he was setting up is this perhaps future challenges against some of the other provisions that restrict colleges from paying athletes in the way that athletes might want.
Is it clear yet?
So right now, though,
sorry, go ahead.
We're talking about laptops and maybe books or whatever. So how quickly could this take effect? I mean, could student athletes almost immediately start receiving these sort of additional perks?
I think that's right. Yeah, pretty quickly. This will just work its way into contracts, and this will be different. But again, laptops, books, internships, paid internships, that kind of thing. That's the way this will particularly be affected. So it's not like all of a sudden, you're going to have college athletes being, paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's not the way it's going to work. But it is significant, and it could change pretty quickly.
Well, the question, Rebecca, I think, and I jumped the gun a little on Anne-Marie, but I was curious. I know that when we talk about this, we think in terms of the big-time sports, big-ticket sports, football and basketball primarily. But this will affect, I guess, right, people who play lacrosse and people who play tennis and people who are on the rugby team, if that's NCAA sport and not a club sport, right? I mean, we're talking about athletics across the board.
Absolutely. And remember, this isn't forcing colleges to do anything. So what it does is essentially open up the market. So if colleges want to, they can. So, one thing to be aware of is, in a way, this, I think, was the correct decision that something anti-competitive was working, and such that there was control over the way college athletics was working because of how colleges were able to pay its athletes. Now that's taken away. It doesn't mean all of a sudden athletes are paid paid differently, it means that colleges can do that if they want to do that. And their desire is going to be determined by the market. So, I do think the effect, you're going to see the effect, obviously, in a greater way with these sort of, high ticket sports that you're talking about, and maybe less so with regard to rugby, but not necessarily. You would have to be more versed in college athletics than I am to know how it will all play out.
So, Rebecca, I have a quick follow-up to that. What does it mean then if so can it conceivably, a university who is recruiting a high school student, can the university talk about compensation that they offer to student athletes versus perhaps another university who chooses not to offer compensation? Can that be used to entice a high school student to attend a university for ostensibly the purposes of a higher education, but sometimes not really?
Absolutely. I mean, as long as these benefits are education related, then after this Supreme Court decision, the schools are free to discuss that as a term of their contract, which means that, this gives a little bit of power, I think, back to the athletes who can go from, school to school and try to find the school that, is most willing to suit his or her needs.
There was at least one other key ruling that came down today. This is Goldman Sachs versus Arkansas, an Arkansas retirement.
Yeah, so, this is a case that I think, maybe a little bit more obscure because fewer people follow the question of class actions and how they work and the intricacies of them than college sports. But it is nonetheless important because it has to do with, these big groups, classes who are suing, under the securities laws and suing in certain ways. And these classes come together in what's called class certification. And so the question at issue was, well, at that stage, at the stage when you're deciding, is there enough, can we certify a class? Can this group of people come together and sue a particular company? Can we consider the nature of the misrepresentation and did it affect the market? And so, that was something that perhaps only could be considered during the merits of the stage. But if it's considered now at this earlier stage, you may see far fewer of these sorts of big lawsuits against companies. And, that's significant in a way in that it affects the financial markets and in terms of, how quickly can these companies hire a lawyer and get rid of some of these cases, or how much time and energy do they have to spend fighting them? And so this was, I think, a significant case in that world if you've been following and if it affects you. And certainly, this is in the background of how our financial system works. And so in that way is also extremely important.
So what other decisions are we waiting to hear about? I'm sorry, Emery. It's the delay. It's killing me today.
I will say we were all waiting today to see if the voting rights case came down, and it did not. So, that's one I think everybody has had their eye on, and, we'll just have to wait. That one is going to have serious implications for these, local state rules increasingly cropping up throughout the country, restricting access to the ballot. And how successful will these challenges be? That depends on the interpretation of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, which has to do with just the anti-discrimination provision. So this is, if you're following politics, this is going to be one of the most crucial cases to come down this term because it will affect the future of those sorts of state legislation that are making it harder for certain groups to vote.
Very important information as always, Rebecca.
No problem.